My name's Anne Dobbin, and I'm a member of the Scottish Laity Network. Tonight, it's my great privilege to invite you and welcome you to the second evening of our Advent journey for 2022. The overall theme for our journey is building the future with migrants and refugees. I'm calling from Galloway this evening, and it would be really lovely if you could indicate on the chat function where you are based right now. We'd love to hear from you. So building the future with migrants and refugees, the overall theme for our journey. This is the theme of Pope Francis' message for this year's World Day for Migrants and Refugees. And before we reflect on that message, let us recall Pope Francis' first pastoral visit outside Rome after his election in March 2013. On the 8th of July 2013, he visited Lampedusa, and both the visit and his homily at the Mass were powerful statements about the focus of his papacy.
The altar itself was very symbolic. The base was a boat that was used by a group of North African migrants who fled their native land in hopes of a better future. During his homily, Pope Francis said one should not get accustomed to the suffering of others. He also denounced the so-called globalization of indifference.
Guardiamo il fratello mezzo morto sul ciglio della strada. Forse pensiamo, poverino, e continuiamo per la nostra strada. Non è compito nostro. E con questo ci tranquillizziamo, ci sentiamo a posto. Chi ha pianto per queste persone che erano sulla barca, per le giovani mamme che portavano i loro bambini, per questi uomini che desideravano qualcosa per sostenere le proprie famiglie? Siamo una società che ha dimenticato l'esperienza del piangere, del patire con la globalizzazione dell'indifferenza.
The globalization of indifference. Throughout his papacy, Pope Francis has consistently urged us to reject the globalization of indifference and to seek to listen to the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth. And whilst many have sought to shift from the globalization of indifference, some governments have openly advocated policies that are anathema to all followers of Jesus. Within the reality of government seeking to create hostile environments, how do we respond to the question that is at the heart of our Advent journey? How can we build the future with migrants and refugees? However, before we seek to address that question, let us, as is our tradition, spend a few minutes in prayer. We invite you to listen to Gita Mitan's "Blessed are the poor in spirit," and we will then spend a minute in silence as we seek to open ourselves to the promptings of the Holy Spirit.
Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Empty one, at the end of your resources, draw closer. Here in the now and the not yet of heaven's kingdom is all you need, more than you could imagine. You belong here. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Grieving one, God's arms are open wide, ready to draw you in with compassion and kindness. You are not alone in knowing loss and pain, and we stand with you. You belong here. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Quiet one, slow to speak and often overlooked, please forgive us when we talk too loud and too long to hear you. Thank you for reminding us that sometimes the still small voice is the very one worth listening to. You belong here. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Warrior one, unflinching in the face of injustice, as you pour yourself out for others, may you know how God delights to strengthen you and how honoured we are to hold up your arms when they grow weary. You belong here. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Wounded one, gentle with others despite deep scars and hurts, you show us the way to follow Jesus. And when you feel your own need for mercy, may you know it in abundance. You belong here. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Honest one, too aware of the depths you hide from the world, remember that it's not by effort of will that you are made pure, but by lifting your face to meet Jesus and finding his eyes full of delight in and love for you. You belong here. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Fierce one, you who stand against chaos and conflict, when the time comes to be still, know that the Father calls you beloved child and invites you to find peace for yourself too. You belong here. And blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Beloved daughters and sons, facing all that is dark and heartless in this broken world, our hearts ache for you, and we honour your pain. We're sorry when we've turned our eyes away because it was too painful for us to look. May you know blessing, justice, and hope for the future. Beloved ones, in this season of Advent waiting, know that these blessings are yours, and may you know the comfort, the inheritance, the feasting, the mercy, the vision, and the belonging of the kingdom of God. Amen.
Butter.
And now, as we hand over to our companion for this evening, I'm going to ask Jerry to welcome and introduce her. I can also already see that people have been putting comments into the chat function, which is great. If you carry on doing that through the evening, and Jerry and I, in the absence of Callum, are going to do our very best to host the questions and answers afterwards. So over to you, Jerry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. It's my pleasure now to welcome and introduce our companion for this evening, Fiona Kendall, who is a mission co-worker with Mediterranean Hope. Mediterranean Hope, a programme for refugees and migrants, was created in early 2014 in response to the surge in numbers seeking to reach Europe by undertaking the dangerous crossings in the Mediterranean Sea. Since installing the Observatory on Migration on Lampedusa, a tiny transit island off the coast of Sicily between Italy and Africa, the programme has grown considerably in scope and scale. In addition, the ongoing work on Lampedusa, Mediterranean Hope now manages 2 reception centres for migrants on Sicily. From Rome, Mediterranean Hope coordinates the Ecumenical Humanitarian Corridors project. This pioneering initiative brings migrants safely and legally into Europe. Fiona was seconded to work in the Mediterranean Hope project as their European and legal affairs advisors. This is essentially an advocacy role, representing the organisation and lobbying for constructive approaches to migration. This requires her to be current with European migration policy, to network with other organisations and policymakers in this field, to draft papers and to deliver presentations at conferences and meetings within Italy and beyond. She is also involved in working with their press office to encounter the anti-immigration rhetoric, which is so prevalent in society and media today. We are delighted to have you with us tonight, Fiona, to hear the stories of migrants and refugees who have crossed the Mediterranean and those who have sought to welcome and integrate them into their country, and the challenge that they have faced in doing this. Thank you again for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Jerry. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm hoping
You're still muted, Fiona.
Can you hear me? That's the first question.
Yeah.
Super. There we are. Thank you so much for your introduction, Jerry, and apologies for that little glitch. It's a real pleasure to be with you all this evening, and I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to be with you, and so encouraged that there is such concern amongst the people here tonight for this issue of migration and the different ways that it affects us. I guess I wanted to start a bit where Pope Francis left off, if I can, because a couple of years ago when I was out on my bike in Rome on the 25th of April, which is Liberation Day, I passed this piece of graffiti when I was cycling towards the Basilica of St. Paul's outside the walls. And for those who don't read Italian, it says, "Borders kill. Indifference is complicity." Borders kill. Indifference is complicity. And for me, that message, which echoes the words of Pope Francis, is really what lies at the root of the Mediterranean Hope project. It's a group of people who simply were not prepared to be indifferent, were not prepared to be complicit in the politics of the border. As you mentioned in the introduction, the programme belongs to the Federation of Protestant Churches in Italy, and for those not familiar with that body, in Italy, as you can imagine, Protestants are very much in the minority. We are thought to be about 400,000 in a population of 60 million, which is 0.005%. So something of a minority sport. But although it's a small number, it's a group of people that are strong in faith and very strong in their commitment to those who live on the margins, and indeed a group of member churches and denominations that had been working for and on behalf of migrants since the 1960s. But there are always things that move us to action. And I'm sure you'll remember, as I do, pictures like these from back in 2013, pictures that started to really reveal to us the horror that people were facing in Africa in particular, the horror and something of what was driving them to make these tragic journeys across the Mediterranean Sea. And it was a particular tragedy on the 3rd of October 2013, which moved FCE, the Federation, to turn its attention specifically to what was unfolding in the Mediterranean and to divert the resources that it was giving to migrants in different parts of Italy to that specific area. 368 people had died that night off the coast of Lampedusa. And many of those on Lampedusa had been involved in trying to rescue those who were just so close to their shores but didn't make it. It was a watershed moment for them, and it was a watershed moment for FCE as well. And that was the point at which this decision was made to create what's now called the Migration Observatory on Lampedusa, to send 2 people off to the island to be in solidarity with the 5,000 or 6,000 or so Lampedusans who live there and who were frankly overwhelmed by the tens, if not hundreds of thousands who were arriving at that time. And I just want to say a word before I go any further about some of the bits of art that you'll see peppered throughout the presentation this evening. Because for us, part of the work of Mediterranean Hope is about telling stories. It's about helping to connect people with what is happening and to connect people in different ways. And the drawings that you'll see tonight are drawings that have been done by one of my colleagues, Francesco Piobicchi, who was one of the 2 people that was sent off to Lampedusa in early 2014. And he uses art not just as a form of therapy for himself, for coming to terms with what he sees, but also to tell the stories of what he sees and to reflect on what that tells him. And so here we have this picture of humanity's indifference. This is a picture of Lampedusa, the island in the background, with the cemetery of boats at the top, the gate to Europe, the big monument that you see on Lampedusa if you're there, and below this graveyard of boats, those boats that didn't make it. And for me, the thing that's really striking about the picture is how the colour drains out of it from top to bottom. And there's a very good reason for that, because what Francesco is conveying there is how the people who cross the sea lose something in the process, specifically how they lose their identities, how they stop being individuals and start to become statistics. And that's a theme I'll come back to a little bit later. So Lampedusa, as you may know, is a tiny island, just about 20 kilometres square. It's only about 100 miles off the coast of Africa. You can see it there on the map, close to Libya and to Tunisia. But by a historical quirk, it belongs to Italy. And so it's the first bit of Europe that boats will reach when they leave the shores of Africa. And that, of course, makes it a very important target in the eyes of those that are dreaming of a better life. The 2 that were sent off to Lampedusa had a primary task, which was one of welcome. And that is still going on today. There's still a team based on Lampedusa. We still have premises there, and we are still every day welcoming people at the dock. And this is no small feat. I was there in September with the team, and whilst I was there, we had something like 24 arrivals in the space of 2 days. Just in the space of the last 2 days, 1,200 people have arrived at Lampedusa. And so our team tries to be there for every single landing. You can see in these pictures, which I took in September, how beautifully calm the seas were at that time, and they've stayed pretty calm right up until now. And that, in no small way, accounts for the numbers that are still arising. The welcome that people get when they arrive on Lampedusa maybe isn't what they expect, because it's mainly the authorities who are there to welcome them. They've got the business of screening, fingerprinting, processing, medical checks to be going on with. And so what we as a team offer is the kind of welcome that perhaps you and I would better understand. A smile, a cup of tea, a warm word, a change of clothes for those who arrive, the babies who arrive soaked because they've been out at sea for 3-4 days at a time. It's very simple, but it's about humanity, it's about dignity, it's about simply recognising that these are people and having an opportunity while they're on the dock, often waiting for hours, to talk to them, to hear their story, to understand what it is that has driven them to come. But the work of Mediterranean Hope on Lampedusa isn't limited to welcome. That, of course, is an important part of what happens, but it's also about watching, hence the development of the observatory. It's about collecting data, understanding who's coming, where they're coming from, how many are coming, why they're doing that, understanding the conditions that they're in and that they encounter once they're there. Because these people arrive and they have nothing. And so many times I've seen people arrive, never mind without a suitcase, without shoes, just as this photograph here suggests. They're taken from the dock to the hotspot in the middle of the island. That's the detention centre where they're processed, and they should only be there for a couple of days before they're transferred to a reception centre on Italy. But unfortunately, it's not as simple as that. And in the winter time, for example, when the seas are rougher, they maybe aren't transferred off the island as quickly as they should be. There's another problem, which is to do with capacity. The hotspot has capacity now for about 400 people. But as I said, when you've got arrivals of maybe 1,200 in the space of 2 days, how do you manage that? It's not an easy place to be. And it's increasingly militarised. There are now perimeter fences there that used not to be there. When I first started going to Lampedusa, there was a hole in the fence. People could come out once they were there. They could access Wi-Fi at our premises or at the parish church or at the local library. They could get information, they could get food. They were relatively free to roam around because they couldn't leave the island. That's no longer the case. And with the pandemic, people became afraid. People became afraid about illness and the overcrowding. And so they started to be put onto boats, quarantine boats as they were called, these big cruise ships that were chartered with really not the access to the facilities that you would want for anyone arriving, least of all people who were traumatised, not just from the sea journey, but from everything else that they had experienced on the way. And so with that information, we have a duty, we feel, to tell what's going on. And so that team in particular is very regularly in contact with the media, reporting what's happening, reporting what they're hearing and seeing, and talking about that and what they experience as the reasons for the difficulties that people encounter, reasons that are not necessarily to do with the sea itself, but to do with the politics. Another really important part of the work in the days when there aren't hundreds of people arriving is about community building. Because, as I said at the beginning, part of the reason for sending people there was to be in solidarity with that local community that was overwhelmed. And there's a piece of work to do there in helping the community not to feel alone. And so some of the projects that we're involved in are very much for the community, such as the after-school work with the children at the local library, or working with these old ladies from Lampedusa to give them an opportunity to encounter the people that come, or the blanket, Yusuf's blanket, which was a most beautiful project. The idea being to remember a baby, a young baby who died just a couple of days after arriving at Lampedusa, and asking people to knit a square in his memory or in the memory of another child who had died. And this blanket now would cover the entire square in Lampedusa because people keep sending in these expressions of solidarity and concern. It's a simple thing, but it's important because it's about remembering, it's about honouring the dignity of these people who cross. And another part of the work is about commemoration. I mentioned to you that the tragedy that triggered all of this for us happened on the 3rd of October, and every year now there is an ecumenical ceremony on the island. Up there in the right-hand corner, you'll see Don Carmelo, who was the parish priest on Lampedusa until recently, and we work very closely in tandem with him or with a successor each year to create a service to which anyone is welcome, people of all faiths and none. You can see down there in the bottom of the screen, in the middle, the crucifix. And I wanted just to mention that because of Pope Francis's particular connection with Lampedusa, because it was he who donated the oars that made up that cross, which now stands in the parish church in Lampedusa. And he in turn had been gifted those oars by the Castro family from Cuba. They were oars that were used by migrants in the Americas, because this is a thread This is not a single border. There are borders everywhere and they're all connected. The politics are connected. Pope Francis saw that. We see it all the time. And we think it's really important to keep remembering, to keep using these opportunities to talk about what is going on. One way of remembering is to use the objects that people leave behind. There are different ways to do that. There's a small museum on the island which is dedicated to those who've lost their lives. It's very simple. You can find in it pages from the Bible and from the Quran, life vests, the small things that people bring with them when they have very little room to bring anything at all. And of course, a very important way to remember people is in the graveyard. The graveyard in Lampedusa is not simply for the locals, it's also for those whose bodies arrive from across the sea. They're all there together, but so many of them are in unmarked graves. And so an important part of our team's work has been about trying to restore names to some of those who've crossed, trying to remember their stories, trying to bring colour back to those people who've gone. And if there's time later, I can tell you the story of Walela and of Yasin. The point is that we collect this information. It maybe seems unimportant, but for us, it's absolutely key because every single person who comes has a story, has a family, has hopes and dreams that they've left behind. I'm conscious of time, but I want to just take a moment to look at statistics because much as though it's important for us to remember each individual who crosses, we can't ignore the fact that numbers are crossing, large numbers. And I wanted to give you a sense of what the trend has been. And you can see there how back in 2016, when it was at its height, nearly 200,000 people arrived on that island, and how it dropped in the years when the Salvini administration was in power in Italy and the ports were closed to 11,000. It's climbing steadily again. 67,477 last year, and we think, well, you can see what the statistics are for this year. It's at 90,000 or so. Part of the reason I wanted to show you that was so that you could make a comparison with what's going on in the UK, because I'm very conscious that the rhetoric in the UK mirrors that in Italy, and we are constantly told that there is an invasion, that the numbers that are coming to the UK are impossible to deal with. But bear in mind that the population of the UK is greater than that of Italy. And look at how it's about half. The numbers that are coming are about half of those arriving in Italy. We can make something or nothing of all of this, but I think my point is this. It's really important when we're talking about migration and migrant issues to try and get a perspective, to try not maybe simply just to focus on our own context, but look at the global perspective and get an understanding of where our context sits in all of that. Lampedusa was where it started, and I certainly won't have time today to talk about all the different projects that Mediterranean Hope is now involved in, but there's a snapshot of the different areas where we're working, and I'll pick just a couple of them in the time that remains, just to tease you, and we can talk about more as if time allows. I thought it would be really important to say something about the Humanitarian Corridors project. Lampedusa is such a difficult context. It's about asylum, it's about people coming who have no idea what they're coming to, no resources, and no other way to get to Italy or beyond. Humanitarian corridors, for us, were driven by the knowledge of what we'd seen on Lampedusa, driven by a desire to find a better way, to find something that would enable people to come safely, legally, to avoid being trafficked, to have a foothold, to have proper support, to have a legal status. And so FCE worked with the Comunità di Sant'Egidio back in 2015 to develop this concept called Humanitarian Corridors, exploiting a little bit of European law that allows member states to grant something called a humanitarian visa with limited territorial validity to those that it wishes to bring safely to their shores. And so the humanitarian visa allows people only to come to the country to which they're brought, not to move to others. But it gives them a legal foothold in that country. They still have to make a claim for asylum, they still have to be assessed in the same way as anyone else. But in contrast to those who arrive off the boat, these people will have been identified and carefully assessed before they become part of the programme. Their claims will have been carefully considered. Not that that's really an issue. The reality is that there are far fewer places on our programme than there are people in need and people who would fit the criteria. In order to be part of the programme, you need to fit the definition in the 1951 Geneva Convention of a refugee, or you have to show a certain degree of vulnerability. And that vulnerability could be manifested in many different ways. It's also the way in which we are able to bring entire families and not just perhaps one person, because there's a vulnerability in being left behind. It's a very special project. And so back in 2015, the Italian government was persuaded that it would be worth running a pilot. It was a brand new initiative at that time, and the Italian government said, okay, we'll give you 1,000 visas in the space of 2 years, see what you can do with it. And what we did with it was to use them all. And now, many years later, there is the iteration of the programme. So every 2 years, another 1,000 visas are granted to bring people safely from Lebanon to Italy. And in addition now, a number of legacy corridors have sprung up. And so it's no longer simply people coming from Lebanon, but also from Ethiopia, from Jordan, from Niger, and in recent times now from Afghanistan and from Libya. In this, we work with Sant'Egidio, we work with Caritas. We've all got slightly different models, slightly different ways of running the programme, but the ethos is very much the same. And we hope that it's a model that is going to be developed and used in lots of different countries in the world. There are other similar programmes, but none quite like this. And the reason is that I say that is that it's not simply about evacuation. It's not just about airlifting people to safety, although that's very much part of it. It's about what happens next. It's about giving people support for at least another 18 months after they arrive, making sure that they have language tuition, making sure that they have access to legal information, making sure that they have financial resources, and of course accommodation. It's about giving people a foothold, an opportunity to integrate. And it is such a privilege to be involved in that programme and to see the effect of it on the people who come. Such a privilege, in fact, simply to stand at a carousel with people and watch them receive their luggage off the plane, in contrast to those who arrive in Lampedusa without even shoes on their feet. They go all over Italy. It's not just a Rome-based programme. It's very intentionally a programme that allows people to be in different parts of the country. They're matched according to their needs and according to their own experiences. A rural community might be better for some, a university might be needed for someone else. And so we're thoughtful about where people go. Some of them go to one of the reception centres on Sicily that Jerry mentioned in the introduction. These are some photographs from the Casa delle Culture, which is in Cicli in Ragusa in the south of Sicily, a remarkable place and an integration model in itself. I wanted to mention, though, just a couple of other things that we're involved in on other borders, because although the project remains Mediterranean Hope, in fact, as I was saying before, we recognise that there are borders all over the place. And one of those where you may have seen pictures is the border between Bosnia and Croatia. It's part of the Western Balkan route, a very different context from the Mediterranean, different meteorological challenges, never mind anything else. It's become an important border because Bosnia, in contrast to Croatia, is outside the European Union. Croatia, on the other hand, is inside. And so, just in the same way as people use Lampedusa as a stepping stone to get into Europe, many people who walk from places like Afghanistan or Bangladesh and finally make it to Bosnia become trapped on this border. It's a really difficult context. The border guards are notoriously brutal. People are trapped there. There's a deliberate policy of not having enough camps for the people who come. They're very often living in squats or farmhouses. We hear terrible stories of people trying to cross the border, being intercepted by border guards, being stripped, having their shoes removed and sent back into the snow and into the forests to their own fate to try again. And so, as is our wont, a team of 2 was sent up to Bosnia a couple of years ago to see how we could be of assistance. Because one thing that we've learned is that there's no point in going with an idea of what you should do. You should go and learn and listen to the people who are on the ground and work with the people who are there and identify good partners for moving things on. And that was what led us to work at the beginning with IPSIA, a Catholic organisation that was building soup kitchens for those that were living in tents in the forest, a place where people could come and be fed, or if they wanted, cook their own food. Again, it's part of this process of humanising, of restoring dignity, of allowing people to do the small things that we all take for granted. And from there, we identified that what we could do that would be of greatest value would be to open a day centre. And that's what we've done. About 9 months ago, we were able to open a day centre in Bihać. And this is not only for migrants, but also for those in the local community who are marginalised, a place where people can come and get a change of clothes or wash their clothes, have something to eat, have some human encounter. We're not allowed to have people sleep there, but we do as much as we can. And as I say, it's extended to those who are on the margins in the local community as well. Because another lesson that we've learned is that if you only look after those who come, you alienate those who are already there. And so all of our projects, insofar as possible, engage the local community as well. And that was what led to our developing a therapeutic climbing centre in Kamenica, also in Bosnia. And this probably seems like a very off-the-wall project to be involved in. But again, it's about engaging the community in a way that allows people to learn skills, to build resilience, to get involved in teamwork, to build trust with one another. It's also a way to enable migrants to integrate, to encounter people that they normally wouldn't have the chance to talk to. And another area where we're working is in the south of Italy, in Calabria. You can see there, or I'm hoping you can see there, that it's the bit of Italy that's the toe of the boot. It's a really beautiful region, but it's so poor and so out of the way that many people don't go there. And of course, another reason that people don't go there is that it's blighted by organised crime. The Piana di Gioia Tauro, which is where our team is based, is notorious for being the area with the port which lands most of the drugs in Europe. It's a blighted place, and yet it's fertile. It's the place where most of the fruit that reaches Italian tables at Christmas time is picked: the clementines, the oranges, the lemons, the kiwis. It's a place worth going to. Despite what I've said, I would recommend it to you. But it's also an area, I'm sorry to say, which is rife with exploitation, because those who are used to harvest the fruit are very often those who have no other opportunities in life. Very often they're migrants, not always, but very often. Very often they're undocumented, people that can't raise their head above the parapet because they don't have the paperwork, they don't have a legal status. And so they're run by gang masters, they are paid an absolute pittance, they are forced in many cases to pay back some of the money that they do receive to the gang masters to be transported to and from the fields. And the little that they do have often is sent back home, which means that they live in what can only be described as hellish conditions, often without running water, and certainly without electricity. In Calabria, we sent another team of 2 a few years ago to get an idea of what we could be doing on the ground and how we could be helping out. And we identified some different partners that we could work with. And one of the partners that we're working with is SOS Rosarno, which is the front face of a cooperative called Mani e Terra of producers who are committed to ethical working. And in contrast to the situation that the exploited workers find themselves in, those who are fortunate enough to be employed by the cooperative are properly employed. They have contracts, they have a decent wage, they have proper working conditions. And that's all possible, well, for a couple of reasons. One, the commitment of the producers themselves, but 2, because it's the producers who set the price of the products that they sell. Because what I've learned, and I didn't know anything about this really before doing the work that I do, is that actually the supermarkets that fix the prices are causing part of the problem, or maybe most of the problem. The prices are set at such a low rate that the producers are squeezed, and then they don't have the funds, they would say, with which to pay a decent wage. If you can cut out the big wholesalers and the supermarkets and instead sell direct to consumers at a fair price, then that gives the producers a great deal more scope to do things in the way that they would want. It's fair trade. And so Mediterranean Hope, along with Mani e Terra, has developed this brand called Etica and is selling oranges, clementines, lemons, and so on to a network of churches primarily across Italy, Germany, and in the last year, even in Scotland. Why are we doing that? Because we're moved. Again, because we're moved. How could you see pictures like this of the conditions in Calabria that the workers often live in and not be moved to do something? How could you not want to restore dignity to these people, to find a way that disrupts the practices that cause them to be exploited? That was the case for FCE. Once again, that is what has inspired them to develop the project in Calabria, quite different to the kind of work that it had been involved in to date. And what's the result? Well, 10% of the profit from the Etica products is ploughed back into our social projects in Calabria. And earlier this year, we were able to open a social hostel. It's just a start. It's only housing 20 people. But you can see the contrast in the kind of conditions that they live in at Dambeso, which they named themselves and means House of Dignity in Bambara, and the conditions that they were living in before. In the summertime, when the fruit harvest is over and the hostel is empty of workers, it is used for solidarity tourism. Last year we had people from Germany and even from Brazil who came because they wanted to understand what the context was like. They wanted to connect with the cooperative and with the people on the ground. As I say, it's quite different from the kind of work that we're normally involved in, but nonetheless worthwhile. And just a final moment to say something about the coordination and the advocacy work that we're engaged in, and to which Jerry alluded in his introduction. It's really important for us to make our voice heard on a bigger stage. We feel as though we have experience to share. We feel that we have something to add to the conversation. And thanks to the Humanitarian Corridors project in particular, we have a seat at all sorts of tables. And it's much better for us to be part of a network of advocacy organisations, because making your own small voice heard above the others is very difficult. But as part of a group and of a network, it's much better. And so, as Jerry said in the introduction, I'm regularly involved in all sorts of interesting conferences and networks. And as you can see, there's a few of the logos there for some of the things that we're involved in. And in fact, some of the European projects that we've received funding for, the COMET project, which is now coordinating a network of pathways out of Africa into Europe, the SAFE project, which is developing a national framework for community sponsorship for Italy, all sorts of exciting initiatives. And all because we stand we started by sending a little team of 2 off to Lampedusa. I looked at the website recently and saw that Mediterranean Hope just describes itself as a migration project. It seems to me that that kind of undersells what Mediterranean Hope has come to do in the space of just 8 years, because I can see these projects doing different things at different levels. A committed group of people, a small group of people, but people who believe that migrants and refugees matter, that they should have dignity, that they have something to contribute to society, and for whom we should be working. And that's really what it's about. We're not prepared to be indifferent. We're not prepared to be complicit. And I guess I'll stop there. Thanks.
Sorry, thank you so much, Fiona. That was really powerful presentation. There, I'm sure it's going to raise numbers of questions that people will want to, to discuss with you. And I'm just, I'm looking at the chat just now, and there are a few questions that have come in, and I would encourage people to, to join and to continue, the conversation. But it's just, it's just so overwhelming when you talk through just the experiences of people, who are trying to find safety, find hope, find support for their dignity, and the work that you and your colleagues and your organisation is doing to try and support that. Really, it's amazing stuff. It really is. So I'm going to go back to the chat now and pick up some of the messaging that's coming through. To start off, is one of the questions that was asked was that there is some awareness, but there's sometimes the emphasis or the priority of what's happening in certain parts of the world, Europe, the migration from Libya across the Mediterranean, it goes off the radar. So how do we keep it current? How do we keep it focused? How do we keep that awareness going? Organizations like yourself are doing such amazing work, but how do we keep that in the eye of people so that they can actually engage with it?
I think it's a great question, because I don't think keeping migration front of people's minds is the issue, as much as enabling people to look at it in a dispassionate or in an informed way. It seems to me that migration is hitting our screens and our newspapers every day, but being used in a way that polarizes society, being used in a way that stirs up a debate that sometimes is quite false. And so I think the challenge for us is to try to remind people actually of the individuals that are involved in that process. For us, there's no better way really to persuade people of the value of migration than to create opportunities for encounter. So for people who are afraid of migrants or what it might mean to have lots of refugees in their community, often the simplest way to overcome that anxiety is to find ways to put them in touch with people who've come. Because so often when you drill down, people will say, I don't like migrants, but I do like whoever it is next door, because they know that person. And so at some level, I think we have to try to do some of that in our newspapers, in our online articles, in our interactions with other people. Try to remind people of the integrity of those that are making the journey. Try to encourage people to think about the reasons for that, the root causes for that. Yeah, that would be my response.
Thanks, Fiona. one of the questions that was asked was there's a new Italian government now, which has got a very specific agenda, or it sounds like it's got a very specific agenda. Are you concerned that there might be significant pushback?
So this is a fascinating, and as you can imagine, we waited with some trepidation for the government to be installed and for the relevant ministers to be chosen, because we've had, relatively speaking, a couple of years of calm after the last government collapsed and the technical government was in place, and of course the pandemic. And the whole, what I was talking about earlier about migration always being on the front pages, actually that stopped during the pandemic, and people started to value migrants in a way that we might not have expected. Now we have a government that's made up of a coalition which includes two parties from the far right, Fratelli d'Italia and Lega. What's been really fascinating for me in the last couple of weeks is to listen to what that government is saying about humanitarian corridors in particular. Excuse me a moment, I've just realised that I don't have my laptop plugged in and I might disappear if I don't do that. That's better. So what happened when the government came to power was that all the rhetoric that we expected about boats in particular came to the fore. They were elected on a ticket of closing the borders again, of keeping the boats at bay. And sure enough, within about a week of the government being installed, we saw that happening in practice. Then, just a couple of weeks ago, things started to change. Georgia Maloney gave her maiden speech in Parliament and already started to talk about the benefits of legal channels. Last week, there was the high-level meeting on resettlement and pathways to protection in the European Union, and the Minister of the Interior spoke at that. He too talked about the benefit of legal migration channels. And to listen to him, you would have thought that he was from a different political wing altogether. He talked with pride about the example of Italy and the humanitarian corridors in particular. He talked about how this could be used as a model for Europe. He talked about the need for transparent political structures that supported channels like that. It was quite astonishing. But what he also said was that they come in tandem with a strong border policy. And so my impression is that that rhetoric, in fact, mirrors what we're hearing in the UK as well, that yes to safe and legal routes, no to people who have the temerity to cross or to arrive in a way that's not sanctioned by government. So it's a bit more subtle than just the blanket "we all hate migrants" rhetoric that we might have heard a few years ago. We're now in a situation where, thankfully, even the new government is applauding the efforts of civil society, and let's not forget that we do this in tandem with government, who grant the visas that allow people to come. It's great to hear that that's being encouraged. What we are concerned about is that at the same time, there is the suggestion that people who arrive in other ways are somehow illegal and not entitled to seek asylum. And as I understand it, that's just what we're hearing in the UK as well.
Yes.
Thanks for that, Fiona. Anne, was there anything coming from you?
Yeah, I'm just looking at a question from Kath, who says, how do people access the humanitarian route? There are so many people, that are arriving in all sorts of haphazard ways and dangerous ways. How do people actually access that humanitarian route?
It's difficult. As I said, for the Lebanese corridor, for example, it's still only 1,000 visas every 2 years. For the corridors for Afghans that were granted in the last year, it was 1,500 visas. So, the numbers we're talking about are tiny. The way to access it is to be in touch with organisations that can refer you in. So in Lebanon, for example, we have a team working in Beirut who are in and out of the refugee camps. In the early stages, people would self-refer. We now ask for them to connect with an organisation that will send them on, so that there's a kind of filtering that happens already before they reach us. But in reality, people often do inquire, and we will, of course, point them to organisations that they can get in touch with in order to make that expression of candidature. After that, there will be an interview process. For the Lebanese corridor, that would involve at least 3 interviews with the person or with their family, or depending on what the circumstances are, looking at whether or not they can be helped where they are, rather than by bringing them to Europe, assessing the level of vulnerability, and then recommendations are made to the team in Rome. And ultimately, it's the government that decides, because they will also screen everyone that we refer for the project. Background checks are carried out. And sadly, it's not unheard of, just even a couple of days before an arrival happens, for people to be blocked. And we don't always know exactly what the reason for that is. In the early days, we understood that the government was nervous about people who might move on to other countries. So this is very much not a stepping stone for secondary movement. The people who come have to be committed to Italy, because the whole premise of the project is that they are a bit like New Scots. The idea is that they become part of the Italian culture. So if they have family in Sweden or Germany or whatever, then that's a bit of a red flag, because certainly in the early days, people did move on to other places. Since then, we've learned, and we're very careful to let people understand what the scope of the project is, what they can and can't expect from it, the limitations that it offers, as well as the opportunities. And I think that's been helpful. The numbers of people moving on have dropped considerably from the original years, but it's not easy to get on. I absolutely accept that.
There's 2 really interesting questions, Fiona. Particularly, one of them is about climate refugees. I mean, some of us were watching the film The Letter from Pope Francis recently, and seeing the stories of people who had to leave their countries because of climate degradation as a result of climate change. We wondered about whether climate refugees will be in the future recognised as legitimately leaving. Just wondered if you'd like to respond to that at all.
It's such a difficult issue, because I'm sure all of us in this particular Zoom room would agree that absolutely should be a basis for welcoming someone as a refugee. But I guess what I've learned is that opening up the definition of refugee presents enormous challenges. And there's a lot of anxiety about the damage that opening up the definition of refugee might do, because we're in a situation where the idea of a refugee is already a fragile concept, where some countries are increasingly not prepared to recognise the obligations that they have to a system of asylum, the UK being one of them. And if we try to renegotiate the term refugee, there are some countries that might back out of it altogether. And so it's not as straightforward, I think, as it may seem at first sight. And I think we have to be smart about how we can perhaps create schemes that enable people to come under a different banner, in the same way perhaps as the humanitarian corridors do, where there are effectively 2 criteria options, one being the 1951 Geneva Convention definition, the other being vulnerability. Because that refugee definition is very precious. So my reflection would be that absolutely I can understand and agree that people who are climate refugees in the informal sense of the word should have an opportunity to move on. But I'm not sure that changing the formal definition of refugee would be the way to go about it.
Okay, thank you. I mean, the other question I was looking at was from Marion Pallister, who's the chair of Pax Christi Scotland, and she's referring to an online event where we listened to an activist called Brendan Woodhouse, and this was earlier this year, and he shared a poem with us, If They Were White, and talked about the racial element in resistance to welcoming refugees, racism. Is that something that you would agree with from the work that you've done, that you do?
Yes, I'm sorry to say,
Yeah.
I would agree with that. And I think we have a very recent example of that we've all seen, perhaps in what has taken place in terms of welcoming Ukrainian refugees.
That's right.
The response to what's happened in Ukraine has been remarkable. I was in Hungary at the beginning of the year with the Church's Commission for Migrants in Europe, and had the opportunity when I was there to visit some of the shelters on the border with Ukraine, and to see the incredible work that people in Hungary were doing to welcome Ukrainians. All the more remarkable because Hungary is one of the 4 countries in the EU that has not been welcoming any migrants across the border at all. But what was striking, and what we learned from people on the ground there, was that there was a distinction being made between those who came across the border that were ethnic white Ukrainians and those who came across the border that were not. And it's a real concern to me that is so blatant. I mean, Hungary is a particularly stark example, but that actually goes on in other places as well. And I guess for me, the Ukrainian situation has really underscored the whole debate about those that we welcome. Are they the people that look like us, that act like us, that are from a similar culture? Or are we prepared to look beyond and start thinking about whatever it is that's inspired anyone to make the journey? Yeah, I would agree.
This is possibly quite a challenging question, Fiona. A lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the media talks about the invasion on our shores. And some of the pictures that have been used in previous political scenarios. Kind of evidences that, and support what you just said about that whole kind of racist agenda that underpins it. So, if the question then is asked, how do you stop this level of people movement from the continent of Africa or from some conflict arenas? What do we, as if you like, the developed world, and I use that word very advisedly, what do we need to do to change that agenda in terms of how do we make it possible for people to live in countries where there is conflict, where there is drought, where there is famine, where there is no opportunities, where systems are corrupt, where it's warlords, etc. What do we in developed world politically, what do we do to try and change that kind of arena and change that agenda?
Well, that's not a small question.
No, it's not. But it's one of these ones that are linked to so many of the other kind of arenas that are around.
Yes, but I think it does go to the heart of the matter, which is that this whole situation is not going to be resolved or changed unless we start to look at the root causes of migration. And so simply having a policy that excludes without also considering what is causing people to move in the first place, I don't think gets us anywhere, because people will still keep coming. And that's that's very clear. I mean, I think it's interesting just looking at the statistics in the UK that even since the Rwanda policy was announced, still people are coming. You know, it's not stopping them. The idea of what might await them on the UK shores.
Mm.
So I think the reality is, and I think many governments acknowledge this, that you can't simply look at keeping people out. You have to understand why they come at all. But actually addressing those root causes is a mammoth task for the reasons that you mentioned, because the root causes are often systemic. They're to do with war, they're to do with famine, they're to do with poverty. I mean, we could talk about a more communist ethic in the world, we could talk about redistribution of wealth, we could talk about the damage that colonialism has done, how we should be paying back, how we should be investing in Africa and in other places. This is a huge piece of work. But I think we have to acknowledge that if climate change goes the way that we all expect it to go, leaving aside wars and poverty and all the rest of it, people are going to travel north anyway because it's going to be too hot for them to live somewhere else. So we're, you know, collectively, governments collectively are going to have to start to get their heads around how to manage migration instead of simply trying to stop it, because it's just impossible, I think.
Fiona, there's a particular question from Roslyn about an organisation in England. I don't know if you're able to answer that. A sort of similar organisation in England that aids refugees, and John's just asked if we have an answer to Roslyn's question, and he knows about the Jesuit Refugee Service. I don't know if you're aware of other organisations that are doing similar work to your own, are you?
Yes, absolutely. So it depends which bit of work you're talking about. So for example, in the UK, we don't have humanitarian corridors, but we do have a resettlement scheme, or several different resettlement schemes. And in Scotland and in parts of England as well, these are being bolstered by community sponsorship. So there are certainly organisations that are involved in supporting communities to welcome and host refugees in the UK. So there would be the Scottish Refugee Council, there would be Reset, Scottish Faith's Action for Refugees, Caritas, the Jesuit Refugee Service, absolutely. In terms of the organisations which are specifically supporting people on the small boats, I'm not sure about that. I'm sorry, I don't have that knowledge, but I can look into it for sure.
Thank you. Gemma, go on, Joey.
Sorry, so I'm just checking through the chat. There's a couple of questions, Fiona, to do with resourcing. You know, how organisations like yourself, you know, how do you get resourced, and how do you maintain that and keep going, I suppose is the question.
Yes. Well, we rely entirely on donations. In Italy, there's a very special tax allocation scheme called 8 per 1000, which means 8 out of 1,000. Every taxpayer in Italy allocates 8 out of every 1,000 euros of the tax paid to a social project. And originally, that would have gone to the Roman Catholic Church. And in time, that's been extended to 16 different, I think, options. And for those who don't want to choose any of them, it defaults to a government scheme which goes into charitable, effectively to supporting charitable giving. The Waldensian Church, which is one of the Protestant denominations that was on the slide at the start, is one of the boxes that you can tick on the tax form. And astonishingly, even although there are only something like 25,000 members of the Waldensian Church in Italy, over 500,000 people put their allocation to the Waldensian Church because it very openly says that it won't use the funds to pay ministers' stipends, that the money will only go to social projects. the Waldensian Church in turn has donated a huge amount of money to the Mediterranean Hope projects, and in particular humanitarian corridors. So a large chunk of the funding comes from that source. We're also grateful for funding that we receive from large churches such as the Westphalian Church in Germany, and I guess in particular Protestant churches across the world, but not only. And also individual donors and congregations, schools, people doing projects. It's amazing. We're overwhelmed by the generosity, really, of people. So we're not supported in any way by the government, and in fact, that's another thorny issue, really, particularly in relation to the Humanitarian Corridors project, not just for us, but also for the other organisations that run the corridors, because it's civil society that is effectively bearing the cost of that. The government supplies the visas and obviously gives those who come access to schools and to healthcare, which is wonderful, but it certainly isn't helping to defray the costs of accommodating people or anything else. So it's a big task.
Yeah, but sorry, Fiona, go on.
Last thing, I should also have said that there's a huge piece of work to be done in terms of resourcing and sourcing funds from, for example, from Europe, from the AMIF fund, the Asylum, Migration and Integration funds, and from other tenders such as that. Sorry, just to complete that.
Yeah, but it does sound that there is some positive engagement in terms of that kind of resourcing agenda. Yeah, and I'm just trying to reflect what that looks like in the UK, and I don't get a sense of because again it's all most of the organisations are trying to support any aspect of asylum or refugee work, outside the formal channels are desperately in needing the engagement of the public through just that kind of voluntary system, and it's really difficult to get any kind of core funding to support that. And another question that's come from Marion, she's asked, we've heard of situations in Scotland where communities, parishes have gone through the process of trying to welcome refugee families, but it's been costly and extremely lengthy. From your experience, are there any shortcuts that people can use? Are there any ways that you can actually, move that agenda faster? Because people that are waiting and don't seem to be able to get through the kind of the morass of the bureaucracy that's engaged with it.
Well, I'm not pretending to be an expert on the situation in the UK, but as I understand it, the sponsorship schemes within the UK are all connected with the UK government's resettlement scheme, and therefore I don't see how the bureaucracy can be avoided. The only way in which that was leapfrogged to some extent was in the Homes for Ukraine scheme, as I understand it, because a large number of people needed to be accommodated at very short notice, and people stepped up. And so that proved to be a bit of a shortcut in some ways. But there's a difficulty with that because so many other people are also in need of support as well. And I mean, certainly speaking, just to move it back from a UK perspective, one of the challenges for us, and particularly in the COMET network, where we're coordinating different pathways across Europe, has been the drain on volunteer support that's happened as a result of the Ukraine crisis. Understandably, people who might have been willing to become community sponsors and wait a couple of years for someone to come through a resettlement scheme or some other kind of pathway, realising that there was this urgent need and a possibility of welcoming someone straight away, transferred their resources and their attention to those people. And that is, in its turn, sadly, leaving a gap in terms of volunteers for these other schemes. So that's complicated because, I mean, you can see it from all points of view. As a host, you want to have somebody soon. You don't want to wait 2 years, albeit that you might want time to prepare yourself and so on if you've got the opportunity to have someone sooner, why would you not do that? But that can cause some difficulties in itself. So it's a really interesting question.
Thank you, Fiona. We've come probably to the end of our questions. Just, you know, as we end, I just wanted to ask you, Fiona, are there any kind of final message you'd like to leave with us? You know, because you've covered so many kind of critical arenas this evening, you know, and I just think it'd just be nice to hear from you, just some kind of final thoughts that we can take away with us, you know, at the end of this evening.
Well, I think I'm really conscious of this being Advent, and the fact that Advent is a time when people are surprised, a time when disruption happens. And it seems to me that the challenge for all of us is to go out and be those disruptors, to bring that message of hope, of hospitality, of love for another person to those around us, and in particular to strangers. And I think my thought would simply be to encourage everyone to acknowledge that we all have the power to make changes in other people's lives. And we may not feel that we have a great deal to offer, or that we have the space to do that, or the skill to do that. But simple acts of kindness make such a massive difference to people who are strangers, who are foreign in any way. And I think if we can try and keep the debate going and make the debate about kindness and about our response to other human beings, then that's maybe the best that we can do. So that would be my message.
Thank you.
Rosalind earlier on said that she was so impressed by the fact that, you know, so much could be done by two people. You know, that idea of two people going somewhere and making a difference. And I think that sort of echoes what you've just said, really, that we can make a difference. You know, even just small groups of us, we can make a difference. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Fiona. Can I just ask one more thing? In the UK, it's illegal for refugees to work. And one of the things that struck me from your presentation was the fact that, you know, the refugees in your film were active and working and, you know, sort of making a presence in a community because of that. I just feel personally that the fact that in the UK, the fact that refugees are not allowed to work, it sort of adds to that perception of them as sort of sponging on the state kind of thing. And I just think it's really wrong, really bad. So I just wondered if you would like to comment about that.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree that people should be given the opportunity to work. Aside from it enabling people to make a contribution, there is also something about this whole issue of dignity and purpose, yes, that all of us need. And having worked with destitute asylum seekers who've been without work for several years, and seen the impact on their self-esteem, on their general well-being, on their mental health, you know, this aspect of it concerns me as well. But it's also about, as I say, that sense of purpose. Just 2 weeks ago, I was sitting in Fiumicino Airport, welcoming some of the people that had Afghans who'd come from Pakistan on one of the humanitarian corridors, and I was chatting to this woman who was a teacher, and I said to her, "What are you most looking forward to about being in Italy?" And she said, "I cannot wait to work again."
Yeah.
And for her, it was just fundamental. She was practically rolling up her sleeves in the airport, and she'll be able to do that. So yeah, I'm with you on that, Anne.
Thank you.
Yeah, just a reference, just the Catholics pointed out, is asylum seekers that are not allowed to work, and in terms of the exact kind of language. Refugees are a different category. It's primarily it's asylum seekers. there's just a final kind of comment from Grace to all of us that said, we need to keep challenging the rhetoric and the media, the politics, very much echoing what you were saying, Fiona, and to remind all of us, that our obligations are to recognise our sisters and brothers and to respect them and to accord them the dignity that they are entitled to. So I think that's kind of yet another key message that we need to hold on to, as we come to the end of this question and answer session tonight. But thank you so much, Fiona. That's been absolutely amazing. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
We'd like to ask Jerry to say a few words of thanks to you, and perhaps to say a prayer for Fiona as well now.
Thank you, Anne. Just to again to say thank you, Fiona. The messaging that you've offered us tonight, that again, just to remind us of our responsibilities and how we can be involved and how we can actually do something to change the agenda. The message, and I think it's been highlighted. The two people going out, and being with people, hearing their stories, and working with them, to affect change. That's such a powerful resonance, I think, for all of us tonight. And what I take away from tonight is that message. Just that despite sometimes the despondency that I personally can feel at looking at things that can I do anything? That message in itself says that a couple of people going out and that amazing changes can happen as a consequence of that. So really thank you for that message, and thank you for your time this evening. It's been really much appreciated. And we'd like now to offer a prayer for you. Loving God, we thank you for the insight and compassion and witness of Fiona. We thank you for her sharing with us ways in which the future is being built with migrants and refugees. We ask that you anoint her anew, such that her ministry may continue to be empowered by your Spirit. Amen. And we'd also like to offer a prayer for Mediterranean hope. Loving God, we thank you for the gospel witness of Mediterranean hope. We affirm our solidarity with them as they make manifest their vision of God's abundant life for all people. Empower them with your Spirit. Amen.
And now we will close with our Advent prayer. Come, Lord, your wounded world is yearning for you to come again. Come, Lord, your weary world is crying out for you to lift us up. Out of our despair, our hunger, our thirst for something better, our need for the food that will last. Come, Lord, come again. We need to begin again. Amen. Next week, we will have on the 15th of December, our next session for Building the Future with Migrants and Refugees, when our companion will be Hayab Johannes, and the title of that evening will be Forced to Flee. And we hope that you'll be able to join us for that. Thank you so much, everyone who's joined us this evening. We look forward to being with you next Thursday. And to those who are leaving the meeting at this point, we say good night and God bless, and we invite you to log off. If you wish to stay and join a breakout room, please stay connected, and in a few minutes we will generate the breakout rooms for you. Good night and God bless to all of you.
Thanks, Anne.